If you're listening to this right when it came out, summer is here. And if you're lucky, perhaps you have some summer plans to visit the beach, work on your tan, catch some waves, and maybe relax with some beach reading. Well, forget the romance novels. Why not dig into a book that will change how you view the beach, the cultural role of beach culture in America, or the complicated histories of the place where you're now digging your toes into the sand? Welcome to Writing Westward. I'm your host, Devienne-Sand. And allow me to suggest that you can't do much better than Elsa Devienne's award-winning book, Sand Rush, the revival of the beach in 20th century Los Angeles. And no matter what beach or other site of recreation and leisure you visit this summer, Sand Rush will change how you view the place and its history. Thanks for listening. Writing Westward is a monthly podcast featuring conversations with authors from various disciplines who are writing about the North American West. It is supported by the Charles Redd Center for Western Studies at Brigham Young University, where I, Devienne-Sand, am Associate Director and a Professor of History. My goal as host is for these conversations to spark your curiosity about and interest in thinking more deeply about the region's lands, cultures, and peoples in the past and present. This is a one-man operation, with me serving as host, producer, sound engineer, and everything else, all roles for which I have zero training. But I am trying to make up for that with my passion about the North American West, and I'll take any excuse to read more about it and talk to interesting people who are writing about the region. If a guest intrigues you, you can find links to their work in the show notes or at writingwestward.org. This podcast isn't monetized, so I'm not chasing subscriber stats for gain. But increasing the visibility of the podcast will help promote the works of our excellent guests. So please pause now to subscribe on whatever app you're using, write a review, follow us on Facebook or Blue Sky and leave comments, and share episodes with your friends, family, and colleagues. At the end of the episode, I will include some more information on my own scholarship and the Redd Center, our programming and projects, and funding opportunities that you could apply for. And with that, let me introduce who we're talking to this month and why. Elsa Devienne is Assistant Professor of History at Northumbria University in the UK. Previously, she was an Assistant Professor in American Studies at the Université Paris-Nanterre and held various fellowship and visiting scholar positions in France at UCLA and Dartmouth. She holds a bachelor's in history from the Université Panthéon-Sorbonne, an MA in history from the École Normale Supérieure in Lyon, France, and a PhD in history from the School for Advanced Studies in the Social Sciences in Paris. In 2020, she published her first book, in French, which won the 2020 French Voices Award from the FACE Foundation and the French Embassy in the United States, was finalist of the French Association of American Studies and French Society of Anglophone Studies 2021 Book Prize, and winner of the 2021 Willie Paul Adams Award, awarded by the Organization of American Historians for the best book on American history published in a language other than English. In 2024, Oxford University Press published an English translation of the book with an extensive new epilogue as Sand Rush, the revival of the beach in 20th century Los Angeles. This edition won the 2025 W. Turntine Jackson Book Prize awarded by the Western History Association for the best first book, and the 2025 Arthur Miller First Book Prize awarded by the Arthur Miller Institute at the University of East Anglia and British Association for American Studies. In Sand Rush, Devienne chronicles the history of Los Angeles beaches in the 20th century, how they were engineered to look and function in specific ways, the concurrent tensions between the types of beach culture and usage that developers and boosters envisioned, and the actual form of beach activities and types of beach users and bodies that accessed them. The histories of public versus private beach development, histories of racial segregation, the growth of unique beach cultures that became broader American obsessions, the act of policing and exclusion of certain peoples from the beaches, and the environmental movements that arose from concerns over these shorelines. In all, Devienne's work trains our eyes to Western natural landscapes of leisure and recreation, and powerfully demonstrates how unnatural and constructed those spaces may actually be, as well as how unseen histories of urban planning, social and cultural entanglements, Issues of race, gender, sexuality, and more are likely hiding just beneath the surface of all of these spaces where we recreate. The text is accessible, written in engaging prose, and resonates with so many intersecting subfields in Western history. In other words, whether you're at the beach or not, this is a book for all of us. Professor Elsa Devienne, welcome to Writing Westward.
Thank you for having me, Brendan.
There's one issue I want to get out there for listeners, and this is something I don't think we've mentioned before, but it's a problem for writers that when a book finally comes out, we often researched or wrote it years ago. And so now we're being asked to talk about something that we worked on so long ago. Sometimes that can be a challenge. It's especially important for you because your 2024 book, Sand Rush, was based on a 2020 original French book, which was based on a 2014 original French dissertation. So we're asking you kind of the impossible task to remember everything that you were an expert on, over a decade ago. But I think you'll do fine.
No, I think, to be honest, like the challenge here is keeping that enthusiasm for the book intact. 10 years after defending the dissertation, in fact, 12 years now, which makes me a little bit ashamed of how long it took. But actually, I am still as excited as I was when I defended or when I published the book in French. Honestly, the topic of beaches just has kept me entertained, interested, intrigued all these years, because the thing is, you can talk about Baywatch, you can talk about sea level rise, you can talk about so much when you talk about beaches. So from the history of science to the history of Hollywood to social cultural history to the history of the body, I don't know, it's kept me interested all these years.
Well, that's the hallmark of a good topic. You're not just sick of it, so that's great. Well, I want to start, we usually start by talking about people's kind of historical connections to the West on a personal level. So you grew up in France. So growing up, what was your perception of the American West as a region? How or what did you think about it?
Oh, Brendan, there are two things that really, really encapsulated the West for me. One, I am ashamed to say again, so lots of shame coming out in this podcast already, is that I was a huge fan of Dr. Queen, MD.
I remember watching that as a kid. Yeah.
So I could not miss an episode of it. So obviously a very problematic show on so many levels, but I was probably had my first first love for the character of Sully. Again, very problematic man cosplaying an Indian. But anyway, so that was my introduction to the West, to a very sort of Hollywood whitewashed version of the West. And then on the other hand, in France, we do have a huge obsession for the U.S. West. I mean, in general, Europeans have an obsession with the American West. And in particular, there's a very, very popular cartoon for children that is extremely popular, which is called Lucky Luke. Lucky Luke? Lucky Luke, I guess you would say. Lucky Luke, who's a cowboy. And so there's been like 35, different books about Lucky Luke over the years, or comic books. I mean, it's not exactly comic books because it's the French-Belgian version of comic books, but still for a children's audience more than a teenage one. And yeah, that was the whole cowboys, outlaws, Indian version, with all its problems. And looking back on it, I'm like, how did I not end up being a complete sexist, racist, person? But thankfully, I came out of it, I guess, with a great interest in the U.S., obviously, because I ended up being a historian of the U.S.
Well, you may be surprised. A lot of Americans, whether they live in the West or not, that is kind of essentially also their childhood. Like in terms of like what they think about the region, it's often largely driven by popular culture and media and things like that. And not till people get older or go to college, they start thinking critically about a region. So you may not, the Europeans are actually sometimes not all that different in some of their early childhood perceptions. So did you think about Los Angeles and its beaches as a part of that region? Is
not
that
really
a Western space in your head originally?
I mean, not originally, no. I have to admit that when the Western History Association gave me the prize for the first book prize, the Turretin Jackson Award, I was I was super happy, not just because it's a hugely, I was hugely proud of it, but because I wasn't sure I could totally identify as a Western historian. But I think the Western History Association has made enormous efforts to be as inclusive as possible, not just in terms of, who is represented in the association, but also what kind of themes and how inclusive the region is. Like the US West can be as broad and as, complex and nuanced as people over time have conceptualized it. And Los Angeles was very much the American West, at least in the late 19th, early 20th century. Afterwards, it gets a bit complicated because it sort of forges its own identity as this wannabe metropolis, which kind of detaches itself from the more rural image of the rest of the American West, right? But nonetheless, fundamentally, LA is anchored in this very Western story of, colonization, settlement, real estate, booms around certain natural resources. There's a lot about that, about race and gender and places where there's moving sovereignties. And so, yeah, LA is totally part of that.
Yeah, you're not the first guest we've had that never would have put on like Western historian hat. Like that's just not how they ever conceived it themselves. But Western historians have grabbed onto their work. It is a kind of big tent field that, because there's so many intersecting subfields, environmental history, women and gender studies, recreation history, race, social history, all these things, you can play with those in Western spaces, even if you didn't necessarily think of them in terms of like broader Western historiography. But your book contributes and sits very nicely in a lot of different strands of Western historiography, unintentionally. So congrats on unintentionally writing an amazing Western book, an award-winning one, at that. Looking back now, have you become more familiar with kind of the broader canon of Western historiography and seeing now like, oh my goodness, this does fit in ways I hadn't anticipated?
Well, I actually, thinking back on it, I am inspired hugely by Western historiography, whether, I realize it or not. You were talking about environmental history, Bill Cronin, that kind of, those kind of work, or Richard White, or Lawrence Culver's book on, the Southern California is a very Western history book. And this was a very important book that I used as a model for my own. So, and many other Western history books, like on tourism, the history of tourism, for instance, Rothman and other classic of the genre, where I've read those, and whether or not I quote them in the book, which I think I do, they definitely were the substrat of SEMrush. For sure.
Well, maybe you're more of a Western historian than you realize.
Maybe.
These are some good bona fides that you're listing off. It gives you some credibility.
No, but to be completely honest, I really now want to go to a Western History Association conference. That's and actually my new research, which we may get into at some point, took me to Oregon last time. So more about this later.
Yeah. Tell us about the intellectual kind of pathway that led you to write a dissertation about Los Angeles beaches. How did you get to that topic?
So I was interested in U.S. history quite quickly, and part of the reason was that I was interested in putting a word onto experiences that I had as just a French kid, and then teenager growing up, and an adult, and that word is race. In France, we can't use that word. It's a taboo linked to, the Holocaust and all this. And nonetheless, I grew up in a diverse neighborhood, and I could, I guess I could feel what you would term a sort of post-colonial reality, in that I was a white French person, and I was supposed to be equal to my little friends who were also French, but not necessarily white, and nobody really would talk about it, but I could feel that there was something not being told. And U.S. history gave me the conceptual tools to understand. Obviously, it's a different story. It's not the European colonial story, But nonetheless, it gave me those tools to understand, oh, okay, that's why I feel uncomfortable, or that's why I'm white, which is something that you can't tell yourself unless you learn about whiteness and race and racism and all this. And so anyway, all this to say that initially I was interested in doing a history of segregation in recreational spaces, because I've always been interested in the ordinary, the everyday, and that's remains the case to this day. And I had the opportunity to go to Los Angeles as a visiting student, and I had still that interest in segregation in leisure spaces, and then segregation on beaches and pools. Around that time, Jeffrey Wiltz published this great history of swimming pools in America, which I use in my teaching, and students really, really latch onto it very well. Anyway, I arrived in LA, kind of like, imagine me, Route 66, Santa Monica. I was dog sitting and cat sitting in Santa Monica. And I arrive and I see the beach, and I'm like, what the hell is happening here? Why do we have a parking lot? Why do we have a freeway, the Pacific, the PCH? Why do we have apartment buildings and houses? Like, who thought this was a good idea? Because in France, beaches, you don't build on beaches. You keep the sand part intact because, I don't know, it's just how it's been in France. I mean, I could get into it, obviously, but so that's kind of what happened. I thought, well, maybe let's not just do a history that's about race. And in fact, Alison Rose Jefferson, who then later wrote her book on Southern African Americans' leisure spaces in Southern California, Living the California Dream, it's called. She was doing that work. And I couldn't replicate that to the level she could, especially since I didn't live in LA. And so I thought, well, let's expand this. So not just race, but what's going on with the environment there? What's the story?
And as you mentioned, for someone who maybe is used to European beaches, you show up in LA and you're like, oh, this is not the beach shoreline environment that you're used to. LA beaches that we know today are not natural. These are constructed environments, they are urban spaces. So before we dive into this 20th century history of beach development, it might be helpful to get some preceding historical pictures in our heads of, say, what Santa Monica would have looked like over the years, that stretch of shoreline. Say, if we were to had a time machine and we went back to kind of pre-European arrival, maybe early Spanish colonization, and maybe even all the way up to, like, say, 1900, like, what would we have seen there so that we can contrast with what we see today?
Well, the beach basically is a very marginal space, even prior to European colonization, even at the time. So the indigenous people who lived along the Santa Monica shoreline and the Santa Monica Bay shoreline in general were the Tongva and the San Gabriel Indians, and while they had some, they definitely used the beaches and used it for various, to go fishing or collect various resources for food, or just to travel to the Santa Catalina Island. Apologies for my mispronunciations, various ones. Nonetheless, it wasn't the major part of there. This wasn't where the biggest population centers were. They were more located towards where the rivers were, so where the Los Angeles River is. And in fact, with Spanish colonization later on, and then during the Mexican period, that's the same as well. It's more towards the inland areas than the beaches that people concentrate. So really, the beaches are relatively marginal area, at least for population concentration, apart from fishing, etc., to some extent. And that really changes only in the very late 19th, early 20th century, when people start using them for leisure. There's a port, there are activities linked to that, but it's still like fairly small. And in fact, when the Port of Los Angeles is finally decided to be established in San Pedro, so not in the Santa Monica Bay, but south of there, more towards Long Beach, that means that those port functions are all going to be moved down south. And so the Santa Monica Bay is going to be really dedicated to leisure very early on, which is a choice at the time that people are very angry about for those who are in favor of Santa Monica becoming the port of Los Angeles. But actually looking back on it with hindsight, it's actually a great thing because it meant that these beaches remained pristine for the development of tourism, which then starts more so in the early 20th century.
But even then in the early 20th century, the beach is a lot smaller. There's not as much sand. And this is part of what kind of starts this history that you're looking at when we start getting to the 1920s and so forth, and all this interest in actually developing, creating a new kind of space. You also mentioned that in those earlier eras, it's a liminal space. And so the rules and regulations, the policing of what kinds of activities or peoples or what's being done, the beach is kind of off the map a little bit, which then as it starts to become a focus for development, creates lots of points of tension and conflict. But till the 1920s, you write, in the early parts of your book about a really surprisingly diverse set of beach users and beach activities. Like, what were some of those activities and peoples that were on the beach early on that come to be in conflict with what's going to be this new set of characters who want to develop the beach in new ways?
Yeah, so on the one hand, you have all those developers who are often themselves those railway barons, right, who are developing new railway lines from the city center, from downtown to the beaches. And often they're creating those beach resorts. It's the case of Venice Beach, famously, of course, but even Santa Monica, it starts off more as a maybe residential, starts off more as a beach resort and then develops as a residential city. But yeah, Venice, Ocean Park, Redondo Beach, all these beaches are developed as beach resorts, often either by entrepreneurs that have a lot of money or by the railroad barons themselves who want to basically invest in something that will bring them money through transport, but also through tourism. And so on the one hand, you have these kinds of people coming to have fun by the beach. And at the same time, you also have the first signs of industrial developments, refineries, and you have the so-called black oil suburbs down the Santa Monica, south of the Santa Monica Bay in El Segundo, for instance.
Yeah, so one of these tensions is you have like these establishment of these early resorts trying to really carefully curate this space for a very specific elite clientele and group of users. But preceding that, there were people of different races. There was some racial diversity amongst the people using beaches. And so we start to have this tension between public and private spaces. And as more and more money is invested in developing both the private and public spaces, I guess I just wanted to note that we do see an increase then in the policing of who belongs and what is allowed there.
Yeah. I see what you're getting at. So, yeah. The beaches so Los Angeles is seen as a place that is more welcoming to African Americans, and in particular for them to be able to buy good housing in places that are in better housing, better quality housing, etc. And in particular, at the time in the 1900s and 1910s, there aren't all those racial covenants that prevent them from buying. And indeed, the beach at the time is still not completely developed. And there are places here and there where people start buying. In particular, the story of the Bruces is well known now. The Bruce are a couple who come in, I believe it's in the early 1920. I would need to get back into my papers to find the exact date. But yeah, they developed this private beach club in Manhattan Beach. And they get very, very successful at it because in the 1920s, there is a not insignificant small Black population in LA that is eager to take part into the Southern California beach culture. So that's one example of the diversity of people who are enjoying the beach in the 20s in Los Angeles. And you also have the historically Black beach in Santa Monica, which is also known as the Bay Street Beach, or sometimes used in a derogatory manner as the Inkwell. And this is the beach that's just south of the now Santa Monica Pier. For a time, these are uses that are allowed, that are kind of like tolerated, I guess, and where people, whether they go in Manhattan Beach or in Santa Monica, feel like they are safe and, can mostly avoid the kind of difficult and potentially violent encounter with white people who think they shouldn't be there on the beach, because the beach is a coveted part of the city, and it's a scarce natural resource. It's a scarce piece of real estate. We know all the story of how the Chicago race riot of 1916 starts off a beach, so we know how beaches are actually potentially quite explosive spaces for interracial relationship in. And this tolerance starts getting less, starts basically declining in the 1920s for reasons we know nationally. In the 1920s, there's a rise of the Second Ku Klux Klan, and in fact, Southern California is not exempt. You have, chapters of the KKK becoming more active in that period, trying to get Black people out of the beach, and not just off the beach as bathers, but off the beach as owners, which is what happened in Manhattan Beach, where the elites there managed to basically tell the Bruces that they have to leave, like use eminent domain, saying that they want to create a park where their private beach is, where they had several little houses and a dance hall. People could rent, in other words, and stay by the beach at the Bruces. And they use eminent domain to seize these properties. And there's also instances of people using crosses, burning crosses because there are several other Black families living in Manhattan Beach at the time. So just trying to get Black people out of Manhattan Beach, which sadly for the Bruces is what happened. They're forced to leave and they're given really a sad price for what is a really incredible property at the time, and they move and they leave Los Angeles. So the story of segregation on Los Angeles beaches is one that is full of ambiguity and nuances, because while at the same time the Bruces have to pack up and leave a thriving business, in 1927 the local chapter, so a couple of years, I believe, or even a year after the Bruces have gone, the local NAACP chapter organizes swim-in at Manhattan Beach following the arrests of a young woman by the police. And they win. They win the case in court. They get arrested, and the courts say, no, this public space is open to all races. And so in theory, from then onward, from 1927 onwards, there is no official racial segregation on the beaches of LA. The reality is more complex. There are tons of story of discrimination. It's on a case-by-case basis. It's on who is there, what's their gender, what's their age, what are they wearing, what are they doing. But there are plenty of story of discrimination or heavy policing, for instance, in the 40s and 50s, of young Black people or brown people or Asian people enjoying themselves on the beach and being told to leave, or, that their presence is not welcome. And there are many other ways, of course, in how informal forms of segregation can unfold, whether it is by making people feel unwelcome or, being told to leave by ordinary citizen, other beachgoers. So it's a very, very complex story, and I really recommend people look into Alison Rose Jefferson's book, which gets into those stories very, very at a very close level, and is full of interesting details.
Yeah, these are tensions that run then throughout your book over the course of decades, various moments of the interests of development clashing with the people who are out using the beach and using in ways that, and we'll get to some of that a little bit later. But let's talk about who some of these other groups are, though. So in the 20s and 30s, you talk about this kind of a new cast of characters of beach experts, scientists and engineers who are thinking how to develop and change shorelines, using science and technology and engineering. But you also talk about what you call a beach lobby, not an official group, but this coalition of groups like the California Beaches Association, the Shoreline Planning Association. So as these kinds of groups, say in the 20s and 30s, are looking at LA shorelines, what vision did they have for the future when they look out? Like, what do they see as wrong, and what do they want to change it to become?
So they want public beaches, first of all, which might surprise us, but actually early 20th, well, 1920s, 1930s elites in LA, they want public beaches, which is so weird to us now when we think of all these people who live in Malibu who absolutely do not want to open their beaches. But there's a very strong progressive tradition in Los Angeles at the time where those business people, a lot of them are business people affiliated with the Chamber of Commerce, they see the growth of LA, the future of LA to be tied in with the idea of public beaches, public parks, and in general a city that is that has nature at its door, that has nature preserved for its people, and that keeps up this image of a sort of little paradise, right? Arcadia.
Yeah, I think you mentioned it kind of as like this hybrid, a vision of like kind of a hybrid suburban resort vibe.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of how that's how they want their community to be perceived as from the outside as well. Like, this is a place you come to live a life of leisure and relaxation, and there's these beautiful spaces around. And that's very much kind of at the front of mind for them.
Yeah, it's the idea that in LA you don't have to compromise between being in the metropolis where you have the downtown, you have the business area where you can conduct your affairs, and you go back home in the evening and you have the cooling breezes of the ocean and the view, and you can go for a dip, and then you can go for a tennis match with your neighbors. That's the idea of the year-round resort lifestyle, and that's very much an LA invention, I would say, and Lars Sculford argues that as well. And that really emerges in the 20s and 30s, and those what I call the LA Beach Lobby, which is, like you said, those engineer scientists, but also a lot of LA officials who are in charge of the beaches. They envision the future of LA beaches as one where beaches are public, and they're also protected from issues linked to erosion, which keep on coming up at the time because of all those constructions that are being done a bit haphazardly. The Santa Monica Pier, the Santa Monica Breakwater, which is supposed to become and turn Santa Monica into a Hollywood Riviera, where it's going to attract the boats of the rich and famous. All these constructions that are done without paying attention to their effects on sand sediments are starting to be problematic. So they see this as, they start to think of beaches as these ecological entities that need to be thought through, that need to be developed with science in mind and with a sort of pre-ecological awareness of how they function and how they are part of a cycle of sand sediments.
Yeah, they're just barely starting to understand the human factor in erosion and changing the environment. And so if we build a breakwater here or a jetty here, it impacts the beach, depending, I guess, which way the currents are going. Like, it impacts the beaches in unexpected ways. So they're starting to figure that out. And I mean, you write about, is it Jones Beach? Yeah, Jones Beach is kind of the first example of a real, like, quote unquote modern beach where they're at the cutting edge of techniques to engineer beaches so that the sands do stay where they are. They also do lots of dredging and pulling, new sands up, but then trying to engineer it in ways that it doesn't all just get washed away immediately. And that takes some time, right? So that's one kind of environmental hurdle or obstacle they have to overcome. But you also write about how it was pretty filthy. Sewage, oil, other pollution. How do they address that?
Well, they semi-addressed that, I would say. So historically, all the sewage in LA has gone to Hyperion, which is about, halfway halfway on the Santa Monica Bay. And all that sewage is literally treated on the beach in the Hyperion sewage treatment plant, which was probably not the greatest idea to do this. But at the time, it made sense because where is that sewage going? It's going to be going into the ocean where it's going to be diluted. And people think at the time that the ocean is it's essentially a big washing machine. So who cares, right? So let's just put it closest to where it's going to end up, on the beach. Well, looking back on it, maybe we could have found a better place to put it because, like I said, beaches are scarce resources. So it's a bit of a shame to put a gigantic poop treatment plant right there. Anyway, so in 1950, they inaugurated the new version of Hyperion because throughout the 30s, 40s, it's a total catastrophe because LA's population booms so fast in that period that the treatment plant cannot in any way take care of that amount of sewage coming its way. And so very regularly you have leaks to the point that people on a regular basis end up walking on all kinds of excrements and other kind of things you find down the toilets. So it's a real problem for a long time. And in fact, it's interesting to see that because LA at that point has expanded to include Venice, but not the other cities, those cities kind of bear the brunt of it. They're independent cities like Hermosa Beach, Manhattan Beach, Santa Monica, of course. Well, all these beaches, they can't really get LA to clean up its act. And that's a big problem throughout the 30s and 40s and 50s. But to be honest, LA only really cleaned up its act very recently. It's only in the late 90s, really, thanks to Heal the Bay, the nonprofit, which is still very active to this day, that we have proper treatment of sewage. But in the 80s and 70s, like the reality was that the beaches and the water was not great quality.
I mean, this casts forward kind of towards the end of your book, where you do talk about how unexpectedly these sites of recreation and commerce and tourism do become the sites for the development of modern environmental movements and organizations. Heal the Bay, being one of them that comes out a little bit later. But yeah, an interesting development because environmental activism, I don't think, is what a lot of people think of when they think about, going to the beach in LA, right? That's not necessarily what they would have imagined having come out of that site's history. So if this is, concerns about like ecological health of the beach and just like having it operate ecologically as they wanted, concerns about literal health with, sewage and pollution and so forth. There's also concerns about kind of socio-cultural health. I think you write that they're very much wanting to preserve these spaces for white middle class suburbanite families, and the trio of values that you say drove a lot of their policies was cleanliness, privacy, and I think the most interesting one, respectability. So wartime America, very interesting period. Post-war, so much cultural attention paid to like proper American families and like what is an American family supposed to look like and act like and so forth. How do we see some of that starting to play, or how do we see the LA beaches, say in the 40s and 50s, being the battleground for where the formation of these American ideals start to play out?
Yeah, so when I said that the LA lobby sees the future of LA's beaches as public and as environmentally more aware of scientific and sand currents, I should say that when I say public, they do have a specific idea of what public they'd like to see on those beaches. And unfortunately,
it's not the whole public.
no, it's not the whole public. It's quite restrictive. I mean, obviously, case by case basis, there might have been people involved who really did want the beaches to be open to all. But in general, yes, the beach lobby, what I call the beach lobby, those shoreline planning association, etc., are made up of people who see the ideal beachgoer as, a white middle class nuclear family, the mom, the dad, the kids. And that's exactly who they are planning for. And as a result, the reality is that they have to change what's happening on the beach at the time because it doesn't correspond to their ideal. So the clean, wide, artificially enlarged beach they have in mind clashes with what is actually happening on the beach, which is, you still have the Bay Street Beach where loads of African and American people, families, etc., young people are gathering, picnicking on a regular basis. In fact, there's an entrepreneur at the time who wants to open a Black private beach club, which would have attracted even more people. You have Muscle Beach, the original Muscle Beach, not the Venice one, which is currently open. So that kind of like mixture of circus, acrobatics, weightlifting that is just south of the Santa Monica Pier, which attracts all kinds of people. And to some extent, people who are seen as weirdos to your mainstream American person, that is like people who are very much into weightlifting or very much into acrobatics. And it's a, relatively interracial, intergenerational, gender fluid, let's just put it this way, population. So that clashes obviously with that ideal of the white middle class family, putting its little picnic blanket and having their little sandwiches by the beach. And so there's Muscle Beach, and then there's also those working class areas that are very that are the kind of places that are traditionally working class leisure places. That is, the piers with their, imagine the old style stand for gambling, for where you'll find someone to read your lines on your hand, or various other slightly seedy
kind of like a carnival circus vibe. Exactly. Which always feels a little bit sketchy is not the right word, that's too judgmental, but like a little, like you say, it like some weirdos. Like this is on the margins of the city, and sometimes people on the margins of societies gravitate towards these kinds of spaces. And that's not that nuclear family with their picnic basket and their kids building sandcastles.
Yeah, imagine kind of like Coney Island style entertainment. So there's an element of sexualization. There's an element of often you're going to have the presence of racial others in one way or another. So this is not seen as a respectable form of leisure, especially since we're in a context where loads of people are leaving LA and the city center area to the suburbs. And so there's this element of white flight, which the beach lobby wants to prevent from happening at the beach. So how do you keep people on the beach? You turn it into another version of Disneyland, because Disneyland is this new reference for middle-class leisure at the time. It opens in 1955 in Anaheim, and it's a revolution in the world of leisure. And so the beach lobby is going to reconfigure, to reshape, to rethink the beaches with that ideal in mind. So it's going to be clean for the white middle-class family. It's going to be homogeneous. We don't want a Muscle Beach there, a Black Beach there. No, everything needs to be the same. Everything needs to be the same width, the same, kind of sand, the same kind of development, the same kind of leisure parks and various lifeguards and other, toilets, infrastructure. You can't have that sort of hodgepodge of hot dogs here, hot dogs there, Black Beach there. No, they don't want that. They see this as fundamentally not modern, of a reminder of the past, of that kind of old style hot dog Coney Island type of beach. And they want something modern fundamentally. And modern, unfortunately, means a lot of people are off the beach.
And they want something so that if they're trying to attract white middle-class families, something that is predictable. So any beach they go to, they can expect the same kinds of services, access, and so forth. But what's interesting is that at the same time, you think about what's happening in popular culture, what's happening, like these Annette Funicelli, what was her name? The actress. Like these like beach,
Funicello.
yeah, like these beach movies that were celebrating the beach as this space for like where teenagers and young people would go and be a little bit wild and have adventures, and the growth of surf culture, which was viewed as a little bit maybe dangerous, and that's not okay. As you already mentioned, not just like at Muscle Beach, like these bodybuilders, tanning culture, and this changing the changing ideas of like what is an acceptable proper body to display and how is it displayed in public versus what's a vulgar display of a body in public. And a lot of that's being celebrated in popular culture or consumed in popular culture at the same time that this beach lobby is trying to go a very different direction.
Yeah, the way I put it in the book is that I say that basically America between 1955 and 1965 is essentially obsessed with Southern California beaches. Like it's an obsession that is obvious in popular culture, in films, like you say, it's the beach movie era, and it's the surf culture that spreads itself in fashion, makeup, design, whatever. People are obsessed with beaches. You have to go on a beach, even if you're a president. JFK gets on the beach. Nixon is on the is also does a photo op on the beach. Everyone wants to be a surfer, and yes, a surfer can be a little bit of a, again, seedy, sketchy creature, but it's also a very healthy creature at a time when there's a huge emphasis on health, as obesity is starting, to climb up, and as in the context of the Cold War, there's this idea that we need, strong, fit men to potentially go to war. So there's a huge emphasis on thinness and being slim as part of this moment where indeed more and more people, because they are not walking anymore, they're this new abundant lifestyle where you can eat as much as you want, starts to create different bodies. And so in that context, being slim becomes even more of a coveted something people yearn for and want to be. But anyway, so what's interesting about those film and the reality is that there's a interplay between the two. Like the beaches wouldn't have been these amazing movie sets for Hollywood if they hadn't been modernized by the beach lobby, if they hadn't been made so beautiful and large and welcoming to crowds. But at the same time, Hollywood would have never gotten to the beaches if they hadn't been attracted to it by Muscle Beach and all these weird things happening on the beach, like we said, the Coney Island style type of leisure. And in fact, even I'm sure the Black beaches inspired many of them as well in their, in the many creative ways people use beaches for bodily expression, for sociability. And we've not talked about the gay beaches, but that's another source of tension and anxiety for the beach lobby at the time. There's many little spots along the Santa Monica Bay where gay men and women congregate and meet each other. And that's another one of those population that's not seen as ideal beachgoers by the beach lobby. So yeah, it's that interaction between Hollywood and the reality of what happens on the beach that's quite fascinating. But yeah, America's obsessed with it, absolutely obsessed with it.
I found it very interesting how consistent the tensions between, say, the beach lobby and, say, some of these subcultures that they didn't want there. Gay populations, the Muscle Beach thing, African Americans on the beach, surfers, those tensions seem pretty consistent, but then the policies that they undertake are not. And there's moments where policing does get very heavy. But maybe only on certain groups. And then moments when it's very lax and they're given a lot more flexibility, or they're like, well, okay, let's segregate all of the surfers to surfing only beaches. But then that's not a consistent policy that lasts for very long. So it's interesting that these tensions and conflicts never go away, and the beach lobby doesn't ever land on a consistent policy. And maybe that's just because we could probably think of some really poetic analogy about the sifting sands of the beach and something, but like the situation is always changing and people's interest is always changing, and you can't keep everyone away from the beach and control what they do there, because it's a place of freedom and leisure and excitement and all of the very things that make people want to go to the beach are sometimes at the core of what they were trying to control or exclude, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think
So just
you
back and
really said
forth.
it well. Yeah, there's this back and forth. And Muscle Beach is a great example. People want Muscle Beach because it attracts so much attention nationally, internationally. Like it makes Santa Monica famous throughout the world. And at the same time, they don't want the sort of less uh, proper and respectable aspects of it to reflect on their image. But that's the thing about the beaches. You can't have these incredible creativity, like I said, and amazing burst of new fashion, new fads, new sports, new ways of being and showing your body and pick and choose. It's a place of freedom, like you say. And when there's freedom, there's going to be aspects that don't quite fit the very narrow version of what's acceptable in the 50s and even into the 60s. And even to this day, there are still, a lot of controversies and debates over what should be acceptable to do on the beach or by the beach.
You also, towards the end of the book, get into some tensions about the kinds of urban and commercial development that would be allowed to happen right up against the beach. And you say that there was a resistance against the Miami-ification of Southern California beaches. Explain to us what that tension is. What was happening in Miami that they intentionally wanted to avoid in LA?
Yeah, so like I said, this public beach tradition in LA and Southern California in general was quite powerful throughout the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. And in fact, there's lots of public beaches that are made, lots of private beaches, that are made public in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, which, I mean, to this day, we can thank the beach lobby for having done this, having brought a lot of beaches in public ownership at that time when the California state had a lot of money and could buy those back from private owners. But starting in indeed the 60s, you start having these projects that are not meant really so much for crowds as it is meant for entrepreneurs or for a certain class of middle-class professionals, and that are forms of semi-privatization of the beach. One example is Marina del Rey. Marina del Rey is this gigantic yacht harbor, which is constructed in the 50s and early 60s. And the way it's built and the way it's is also thought as a public-private development with private developers, private entrepreneurs and developers building apartment buildings all around the marina and have it in a way that makes it very difficult to access from the outside and is seen as a form of privatization. Other forms of public-private developments around that time happen in other places, and with the same attempt at turning beaches into much more, profit-generating, semi-private environments. And that's where we start seeing a pushback against that vision of the beach that we see, thriving in Miami with hotels having their own private beaches, etc., and developments that go up to the shoreline, to the high tide line. So you see a movement in the late 60s and early 70s that starts very much in Santa Monica around the renters' rights movements, which is happening at the same time, around this idea that actually we want to keep the beaches mostly not developed or not more developed than they are. One big project that is at the time, for instance, is having a gigantic artificial island or constructed off the shoreline of Santa Monica, where you would have had, skyscrapers and a freeway. And those kinds of developments are out of question for a lot of people who are developing a more environmental awareness. At the same time, some people want to get rid of the Santa Monica Pier, which they see again as a place that is associated with the seedy working class leisure we've talked about. And so taken together, these different sensibilities about the beach birth this new movement of public beaches, of keeping beaches open to the public, to everyone, and not have it become the sort of private playground of the rich and wealthy, who can build and afford those hotels and skyscraper by the beach. And this comes out of a moment when California-wide, there's a push for more public beaches, and in particular the movement for the Coastal Act in 1972, which is going to create the California Coastal Commission. This is not just a California story, by the way. It's a national, even international story. Globally, people in the late 60s, early 70s start to become aware of the fact that beaches are extremely precious, and that there's a movement of people wanting to live by the beach, even more so than before. And there's a realization that if we don't protect the shoreline, soon it's going to become the private playground of the rich. And it happens everywhere, in France, in the UK, in the US, on the East Coast, on the West Coast, more or less successful in different places, very successful in California, with the establishment of the California Coastal Commission, which to this day protects the rights of the people of California to access the beach.
Yeah. It's at that same time, though, you write in the late 60s into the 70s that there is a slowdown of, like, California stops acquiring or stops kind of the purchasing of private beaches to make them publicly available. That slows down a little bit. And then in the decades that follow, though, we see lots of continued public interest, especially as you write about some new forms of the environmental movement and people focused on beaches as a space for the need for environmental reform or protection or policies and so forth. All of this, I think, is really instructive for people who have these kinds of landscapes in their backyards, be it a beach or, other sites of leisure and recreation that we just don't think critically about. And your book really helps us to pause and say, oh, this is maybe a constructed space, or this is maybe a space of historic and ongoing conflict and tension, right, between public and private, between all these different things. But when I go to Santa Monica, I'm never thinking about that, but I probably should be, right? It's just a good reminder that these spaces have really long, complicated histories and maybe complicated presence, like today, that we don't necessarily always recognize. I wanted to zoom out a little bit because we're running a little bit short on time, to the West more broadly. And I know you're claiming you're not a Western historian, but I think you're more of one than you think. What kind of interpretive lenses do you think your work might give us for better understanding other quote-unquote Western locations where we see this overlapping of suburban and urban development with landscapes of recreation? Someone who studies, the Rocky Mountains or something, picks up your book, how do you think it might give them a new set of lenses through which to view what they study or where they live?
Well, I think it's maybe in the way that we have all these cultural assumptions about what a space of leisure should be like and should look like. Like, what is a ski resort supposed to look like? What is a mountain range open for recreation should look like? What does, we carry these expectations, and we don't necessarily, indeed, like you said, critically examine them, but they are from somewhere. They are, and because the West was often seen as this tabula rasa, as this place where this kind of blank page where people could reinvent things that had gone wrong on the East Coast or things that had gone wrong in Europe, but at the same time draw inspiration from it. I think the West is a particularly interesting place to think about these questions. Just like the beaches, they thought, you know what, we don't want to do Coney Island, but we like the Mediterranean Riviera, at least some aspects of it. And we like the French northern coast. And we like also Blackpool for this and that. And we like Atlantic City, but not this and not that. So they looked at LA, they had all these influences and traditions, and they were like, well, what do we want a modern beach to look like? Let's, reinvent it for a new era, for a new century, and for a new city. And this is a very Western thing to do, to arrive and pretend that space, the environment, is a blank page, and use whatever, pick and choose from those European and East Coast references you have. And I think that's what maybe my book can bring to other spaces in the West, this awareness.
It's not a tabula rasa, right, where we just get to reinvent the world and the environment however we want, but it's often how Western history has unfolded. And it's often what makes Western history so interesting is because, for all of man's best laid plans, like things never turn out or go as smoothly as they might want as they're trying to impose their will on these supposedly blank spaces, right? That's where all of the interesting, juicy history happens. Well, as we close, do you want to give us a preview about how this book is segueing into the work that you have underway right now?
Yeah, I mean, I was talking about Oregon earlier, and I can make the connection between how did I ended up writing about Oregon from writing about California beaches. So when I brought the book to Oxford University Press, one of the big difference between the French and the American version is that they wanted an epilogue that took the story to the present, whereas the French book ended in the 70s at the end of that big modernization of the beaches that I described with the enlargement of the beaches, etc. And so I started, researching the very recent history of the beaches. And one thing that I kept on bumping into was people cleaning beaches. And I was like, what's up with people cleaning beaches? When did you start cleaning beaches? What's so important about it? Isn't it just a form of greenwashing? And I realized that plastics was the problem. Before plastics, you don't really need to clean beaches. Obviously, there's sewage, like I said, but it's a different kind of problem because plastic doesn't biodegrade. It never goes away. So that's a problem starting in the 70s and especially in the 80s. And so I thought, well, when did people start cleaning beaches? And I found the story of those women, but first of a woman in Oregon who in 1984 named Judy Nilsson. She's still alive to this day. Hi, Judy, if you hear me. And she decided not just to clean beaches because people were already cleaning beaches, but she decided to count what she found and divide it by type of material to bring into awareness the problem of ocean plastic pollution, which is not the recent problem people make it seem like it is. No, people have been campaigning and, talking about it since the 80s. And so Judy organized an Oregon-wide citizen science beach cleanup, getting people to count what they find. Is it wood? Is it paper? Is it plastic? And then the idea went on to become what is now a hugely popular environmental event every September, the Coastal Cleanup, which is organized by Ocean Conservancy. And so I wrote the history of that, and that led me to my new project, which is a history of mobilizations against plastics from the 80s till the present, trying to show that we've been fighting plastics for a long, long time, and we need to learn from those pioneers who started in the 80s and who had some successes, but also, eventually failed because we find ourselves in the situation we're now.
I love how it kind of orients our view again to the edges of the continent, to maritime spaces. Because I remember as a kid, these PSAs and commercials on TV, a turtle with its head stuck in like the plastic rings that pop bottles used to come attached on, or and now discussions of microplastics and this huge floating garbage patch out in the Pacific. The beach and oceans seem to often be where environmental focus really gains clarity and we're real. A lot of action begins to start. So that's really great. I'm excited for this, Elsa.
And if I may add this for your listeners, if you liked it, I did do 2 podcasts about those women in the 80s and 90s that can be used in combination with my article in environmental history. So I'm just saying that as a teaching resource that can work for people who want to teach environmental history, women's history, history of plastics, petrochemical histories. It's Making Plastics Count is the title of the environmental history article.
I'll link to it in the show notes. I'll put a link there. Well, Elsa, congrats on the dissertation, the French book, the English book, all of the awards, and I hope that you will decide, or it will be possible for you to come to a Western History Association meeting sometime soon.
I definitely hope so. Thank you for having me.
All right. Thanks so much, Elsa. We'll hopefully see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you again for listening. You can find links to our guests' works in the show notes or at writingwestward.org. This podcast isn't monetized, so I'm not chasing subscriber stats for my own gain. But increasing the visibility of the podcast will help promote the works of our excellent guests. So please pause now to subscribe on whatever app you're using and write a review. Follow us on Facebook or Blue Sky and leave comments. And share episodes with your friends, family, and colleagues. Writing Westward is supported by the Charles Redd Center for Western Studies at Brigham Young University. We are an interdisciplinary research center that supports academic research and the promotion of public understanding of the North American West. We host regular public lectures, often live streaming them on our YouTube channel. We have an annual funding cycle with award, grant, and fellowship categories that nearly anyone can apply for if they are researching or working on the region from any disciplinary approach or towards any final product. Learn more at reddcenter, reddcenter.byu.edu. Our theme music was provided by local Utah composer Micah Dahl Anderson. His website is linked in the show notes. My name is Brendan Rensink, and I serve as the podcast host, producer, sound engineer, publicist, and everything else for the podcast, so you can direct any praise, or more likely critiques, my way. I'm the author and editor of a number of books, articles, and chapters on the North American West, borderlands, native peoples, genocide studies, religion, the environment, and more. My recent titles include a 2018 book, Native But Foreign: Indigenous Immigrants and Refugees in the North American Borderlands, which won the Best Historical Nonfiction Book Award from the Western Writers of America. A 2019 anthology I co-edited with Jane Hafen, Essays on American Indian and Mormon History, which won the Metcalf Best Anthology Book Prize from the John Whitmer Historical Association, and a 2022 collection of essays I edited entitled The North American West in the 21st Century. I recently launched a new series with the University of New Mexico Press entitled The West in Context. Send me a note if you have a manuscript to propose for publication. Here at the Redd Center, I'm also the general editor and project manager of a great digital public history project, Intermountain Histories. It is a free mobile app and website, intermountainhistories.org, that curates student-researched and written micro-histories of the region, complete with archival photos, bibliographies, and more that you can use remotely or on a road trip. To contact me about the podcast, my own research, the Redd Center, or anything else, head to bwrensink, that's bwrensink.org, email me at bwrensink@byu.edu, or follow me on Blue Sky at Brendan W. Rensink. Until next month, be well, be curious, be kind.